Welcome to the 2020 Earth Science Week webinar series, Earth Material Frontiers. This series is being hosted by the American Geosciences Institute, the Mineralogical Society of America, and the International Raw Materials Observatory. We would also like to thank the sponsors of this webinar series, the International Union of Geological Sciences, Resourcing Future Generations, and the Irish Center for Research in Applied Geosciences. It is my pleasure to introduce Victor Correa of the International Raw Materials Observatory, who will be speaking to us today about consumers, the most potent army against conflict minerals.
The title of this presentation seemed like a great teaser when I sent it to the American Geosciences Institute a couple of months ago. But now, looking to it again, I just realized that it's not exactly original because from a different perspective, I'm also talking about capitalism, the consumer's part, and warmongering, so the conflicts part. And this is not exactly news because, unfortunately, war and minerals under capitalism have been associated for a long time. The outline of my presentation can be briefly explained in just 3 points. So I'll be talking about the background of the topic, conflict minerals, and also sharing with you how I became interested on the topic. I'll be also talking about existing traceability schemes. Some of them cover just a few commodities and just a few steps on the value chain. Others cover the entire value chain. And finally, I'll be also sharing with you my perspective and why I do believe that consumers have the real power to curb the extraction and the trade of conflict minerals. On the background, I'd like to start by saying that before joining the International Raw Materials Observatory, where I am now, I served as president of the European Federation of Geologists between 2013 and 2019. And the European Federation of Geologists is the European body that groups all the national professional organizations of geologists from the European continent. I mean, not only from the European Union, but also from countries located outside the European Union, as for example Serbia or Russia or Turkey. And my professional background is also in mining, so I started my career as a mining geologist working in VMS deposits in the Iberian Pyrite Belt, and in my career I've worked in Africa and also in South America. So when the topic of conflict minerals become into the public discussion, that was something that I was aware of, especially from my work, field work in South America, where I've been in contact with artisanal miners in several situations. It's important to say that this was especially relevant in 2014-2015 to Europe because policymakers and also the industry associations realized in those years that the European was strongly dependent on imports from minerals coming from third countries. And especially relevant was the dependency of imports to the energy transition. One of the first minerals that was being discussed at the public level was tantalum, and it just happens that the European supplies of tantalum were coming mainly from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So when news and articles in magazines were just highlighting that warlords were controlling the extraction of tantalum in this country, that of course create some red lights among policymakers, especially because these news also showed that the warlords were enslaving people, in many cases also children, doing all sorts of human rights abuses. And it was in this context that the European Federation of Geologists decided to join other groups that were lobbying the European Parliament for the approval of a regulation to ban the imports of conflict minerals into Europe. I mean, this was not exactly new. I mean, the European Union was not being creative or innovative, because it was a move that was made by the United States in 2010 with the Dodd-Frank Act. I believe that was the first regulatory framework that was basically preventing companies from buying minerals coming from conflict areas. So the European was just following that approach, and the European Parliament successfully approved a regulation in March 2017 that was banning completely the imports of minerals from conflict areas. This regulation entered into force in 2020, so this year, and of course the DFG was actually lobbying for this regulation, basically explaining the different political groups, how the minerals were mined, how they were processed, etc. I must also underline that I've never visited DRC. It was one of the African countries I never visited before the approval of this regulation. But I had the opportunity to visit the country in 2017, 5 months after the approval of the regulation, and what I found was completely different from what I expected. So the first impression that I must share with you is that the DRC is a big country. It's in fact a huge country. If you compare the size of the DRC with the size of Europe, you can see that this country is basically half the size of the old European Union countries combined. Even if you compare it with the size of the United States, and this is the map on the left lower side of the slide, you can see that the DRC that is located in the center of the African continent, it's almost 1/3 the size of the United States. And this explains this, I mean the size of the country, and also the fact that the DRC has no infrastructure, meaning that if you need to travel from the capital, Kinshasa, to another big city, you probably won't have a road. I mean, sometimes you don't even have the physical road because the rain just washed away bridges or whatever, so sometimes you cannot travel on the wet season. And if you have the means, you can resort to airplanes, or if you don't have, you just go by foot. So this is a country where the lack of infrastructure and the geography creates the conditions for armed groups, for warlords to seize some regions and to have the control of these regions. And that explains why the DRC is having a civil war for more than 1 decade. And in that civil war, you have more than 200 armed groups identified. So 200 armed groups fighting among each other, and a government that is not capable to fight them all because you don't have the infrastructure to move the army and from one side to the other, explains the situation and why this civil war is going almost forever in the DRC. In some cases, and this is the reason why you have these provinces in red highlighted, this is the North Kivu and South Kivu provinces in the Great Lakes region. In these provinces you have armed groups, more than 60, and these are on the right side of the slide. More than 60 armed groups are being funded by the extraction of minerals. Of course, these warlords control the mining areas of the artisanal miners. And the artisanal miners, of course, they are exploited by these groups. So this is what I was expecting to find in my first visit to DRC, but what I found was different. So I was visiting not this area, but the south of the country, the province of Katanga. And in the province of Katanga, you have also big miners, Western companies working, operating, extracting copper, for instance, in Lubumbashi. And what you see is that close to these mining areas where the big miners are operating, on the immediate vicinity, you have normally artisanal miners, and these artisanal miners brought the families to the site. And I talked with these people, and they explained to me that they were bringing women and children together with them because first they were not full-time miners, they were farmers. And when they have, on the dry season, they have not work on the farm, so they bring all the family to the mine site, and this was like a complement of the family revenue. And they were working here for a couple of months, and then they went back to their village. And they brought women and children together, because if they leave the women and children alone on the villages, again, because this is a country in civil war, if they leave them behind, they will be probably kidnapped, and they don't want to have that risk. And on the mining sites, the children and women were there because there are no schools, there are no kindergartens, there are no nurseries, so all the family was working on the site. And I must say that to me this was a surprise, and it was also something that reminded me of stories that I'm from Portugal, and in Portugal during the Second World War, sometimes farmers were also digging for minerals. And the stories that my grandfather told me, that during the Second World War he was also digging for tungsten, and buyers were passing and buying the tungsten, and that was a complement of revenue. That was important for him, because people was very poor. So this is in a way similar to the situation that you see these days in the places I visit in Katanga. And what these people told me was that after the approval of the European regulation, many buyers left the country, meaning that before March 2017, they have Chinese buyers, Lebanese buyers, but also French and Belgian buyers on the site. And of course, there was this balance between offer and so supply and demand. And they can make like $15 or $20 in a good day. And what they told me is that after the approval of the regulation, the European buyers left the country, and so now they had less buyers, and that balance between supply and demand was affected, and now it was difficult for them to make more than $5 per day. So a regulation that was approved in Europe with the best of intentions was not having the expected outcome. So it was in this specific region making poor people even poorer. So I guess the question now is there hope for these people? And of course the answer is yes, there is hope. And there is hope because there are numerous sustainable schemes that were created, and these sustainable schemes address not only the conflict aspects, but also the social, environmental, and even the economic grievances that mining can cause. And all these schemes started to being built not after the approval of the European regulation. They started being built much before, when the US Dodd-Frank Act was approved in 2010. It was also the year when the OECD approved their due diligence guidance for responsible supply chain for minerals. And you see that you have many different schemes. Some of them are addressing specific steps in the supply chains, others are addressing specific commodities. And all this diversification has one advantage, if you want, but it also has one disadvantage. So two sides. On one end, you can say that all this diversification is good because you have tailor-made solutions for specific problems and to specific or targeted stakeholders. But on the other side, you can also say that this generates an overload of information, and it can also create some skepticism among some stakeholders because it undermines the recognition and the uptake of some of these sustainability schemes. And of course, this is a problem, but looking closer, you see that despite the big number, you see that these sustainability schemes can be grouped into small groups. So you see that some cover all minerals, but they are not commodity specific. And this is the case for the International Finance Corporation IFC scheme or the ICMM scheme. You also have two exceptions on this, which are of course the gold, the cyanide gold, and the WGC schemes for gold, because these are focused on exploration and mining. But when you are talking about conflict minerals, and these are normally what is called the 3TG. So 3T, this is tantalum, tungsten, and tin, and G for gold. So these 3T and G, they are not normally followed across the entire supply chains. In some cases on specific regions, like the Great Lakes region, and this includes Rwanda, Uganda, the DRC, and the countries in that region. But also for other commodities, and this applies of course to diamonds, to gold. The gold it's a critical one, we'll talk about it later, but also to other commodities like natural stones or aluminum or even coal. So you have different commodity schemes that are being applied to different steps in the supply chain. I must highlight a choke point here, because if you look to different supply chains, you are from the exploration until the manufacturing and then retail and even recycling. But there is a choke point here. It's highlighted in the center of the graphic with the number 3, because this is the refining smelting stage. And this is a choke point because this is where you have less companies. So it's a critical step, because if you control the smelting, then you have the capacity to control, to have a good overview of the entire supply chain. And this is good news. The problem, however, is that normally the schemes that are addressing the smelting stage, they were developed for the 3T and G, so the conflict minerals only. Of course, these schemes are also benefiting from, they are being boosted, leveraged from technological developments, and perhaps the most important is blockchain. We know that everyone talks about the use of blockchain to follow the minerals across a supply chain, because you can use the same database with many different users, and if there are some effort to change the values in database, this will be immediately highlighted. So blockchain seems like an effective technology to address this. But you have others. You also have DNA markers, and you also have digital tags. But and these technologies have evolved a lot. I was attending a webinar a couple of weeks ago from a supplier that had developed an app for the mobiles that was using blockchain, and with that app, anyone in the supply chain can check the certificates of any given shipment of minerals, whatever the scale, from the big shipment to the minor, if you want, bag size that is being used by artisanal small-scale miners. Of course, there is also problems for some of these technologies. For example, the DNA markers, and these are markers that physically mark this lot of minerals. So you can put a DNA marker on this bag, and you put the marker inside the bag, so in the ore. And you can do it with DNA, but we can also do it with quantum dots. It's another technology. So these systems exist, but we still have problems dealing with that. And I believe that we have at least 3 different problems. Problems that, I mean, that open the door to frauds. First, the smelting process. You need to remember that in the smelting process, you can mix different minerals to create an alloy, or just a smelting point for the same mineral can also erase all the efforts to tag that mineral, especially if you are using the DNA tracers or the quantum dots, because the melting point of these minerals is so high. For gold is around 1000 degrees Celsius, and this is 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. And for tungsten, which has the highest melting point of all minerals, it's almost 3500 degrees Celsius, and this is more than 6000 degrees Fahrenheit. So these temperatures basically raise all the efforts that exist to physically track those minerals. And of course, on the smelter, because you can mix different ores from different origins, so in a way it also erases the capacity to trade. And that's the reason why the tracing schemes, the traceability schemes apply to smelters. They are focused on physical inspection, so audits, and also on mass balances to check or to avoid the possibility of frauds. But this is one problem, so the smelting. But you have 2 others, 3 in total. The second is the mine. And in one of my visits to the DRC after 2017, I made several. In one of my visits, I was working with the people from the Ministry of Mines of DRC, and they were telling me that one of the big problems they were facing was smuggling. And because they were looking for the revenues, for the royalties that they were expecting to receive even from the artisanal miners, but they noticed that much of the minerals that were extracting close to the border with Rwanda were being sold to smugglers, and these smugglers were transporting these minerals to Rwanda, and in Rwanda they were inserted in mines that were validated by the certification schemes. And this is why, like laundering the minerals, because they were not coming from that mine in Rwanda, but when the people that was certifying and making the physical audits in the field, the mine owners were saying, no, this was extracted here, and it was mixed with minerals from that exact mine. So it was entering the supply chain as a laundry mineral, and of course this is something that it's difficult to control. It's not exactly like that in all countries, and of course this is more difficult to control depending on the mineral. For instance, gold is probably the most difficult to control because a small amount of gold has a high value. And again, using the example of gold, you can go to countries like the Burkina Faso in Africa, where all the gold that is exploited by artisanal miners is mandatorily, by law, they need to sell it to buyers from the government. And to prevent the possibility of other buyers that are not from the government appear and try to buy that gold, the government is paying a price that is slightly above the market price. And that was like a brilliant solution, because it gives the government the control of all the gold that is being extracted by artisanal miners. So that's one solution to that problem of smuggling and trying to hide the origin of the minerals. The third problem applies mainly to gold, and it's the size of the supply chain and also the value. I mean, gold is something that you can just dig, you can extract, and then you transport to some place where it's melted, and then from that point it's transported to some jewelry maker, and you completely lose track of that gold. And meaning that it can go from Africa to Dubai in 2 steps, that are controlled by warlords or by smugglers, and that's also a problem to the control of the supply chains. Gold is also a problem because these days, and I remember this is an insight that I received from colleagues working with Europol, and they were telling me that in some countries in South America, and the example they gave me was Colombia, drug lords were now controlling the illegal miners of gold in the jungle, meaning that these drug lords have a good knowledge of the region because they were producing coca in those regions. Then they realized that gold was having a bigger demand, and they started controlling the artisanal miners of gold, and now they control the full process from extraction to smelting, and that represents a revenue that is bigger. At least that was news from the beginning of this year, and what his colleagues were telling me, that the revenue that the drug lords are now receiving from the illegal gold mining is bigger than the revenue that they were receiving from the drug production. So this explains the problems that we have with traceability, and also brings to this conversation Tolstoy. I don't know if you are familiar with the Anna Karenina principle. Anna Karenina is a book that was written by Tolstoy, and the Anna Karenina principle basically states that if you have a problem in one factor in a specific process, then all the process might be subject to failure. And of course this happens because the open quote of the book, it says that all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And this is a principle that is well known from people working in statistics and in management. And of course the example of conflict minerals is a good one for the application of this principle, because you can have all the traceability schemes in place, you can have everything, but if there is one step that might not be controlled because it's difficult to track, then all the process is prone to failures. And of course we know that we still have something to do to cover all the possible deficiencies. However, I do believe that we are on the right track. And we are on the right track because all these traceability schemes are making the topic of conflict minerals more visible. And if you go to the internet these days, and this is a research that I made yesterday, and if you just type conflict minerals traceability or responsible sourcing, and if you cross this with the names of companies, you see that you have several sites providing ratings of companies according with their responsible sourcing let's say approach. And you have several. You have even something called the wiki rate, that is basically rating companies from all different sectors, and you can see which company is more responsible on their practice to curb the illegal trade or the trade of conflict minerals. So this is the reason why I do believe, because if you have that approach, and in these days where these especially brands that have a reputation to defend, like Apple or IBM or 3M, or I mean, they don't want to see their name associated to conflict minerals, and for that reason, and because they have a reputation to defend, they are the main enforcers of the existing traceability schemes, and across the whole supply chain they oblige their suppliers to use that. and this is good news. Of course, this is and the reason why I believe that consumers have the power, and this is good news. However, we still have a big way to go. And the reason why I'm saying this now is that we need to engage consumers. Of course, I'm a geologist, I pay more attention to this topic. I believe that many of you in the audience are also interested in the topic, so you are aware of it. But that does not necessarily mean that all consumers are aware of this. And my experience on that awareness perception can be illustrated by something that happened in 2019. So on that year, the European Union launched a tender because they were trying to create a platform to inform consumers and also SMEs, owners, on what will be changing by this new regulation that entered into force in 2020. And to build up that platform, they asked for tenders. And the International Raw Materials Observatory was preparing a tender, so we were trying to approach different partners, and we were inviting associations of consumers from different European countries to be in the advisory board of our project. So in 2019, I contacted more than 30 associations from different European countries, associations of consumers from different European countries. And you know how many of these 30 answered saying that they were interested in the topic? And this was to me a huge surprise. And now if this was a face-to-face meeting, I was asking people to raise the hands, but this is not. So I will give you the number. So of the 30 associations I contacted, only one answered that yes, we are interested in being in the advisory board of that project. And the others, because I made the invitation letter, then I made a follow-up, in some cases with face-to-face meetings, and they told me that they were not seeing the link between mining and the minerals that were being extracted and the products that consumers were buying. And to them was more important the efforts they were doing in those times on the approval of regulations about energy efficiency for the refrigerators or washing machines. So that's what they were focused on. So we still have a big way to go to make consumers aware of the power they have. Of course, when people is aware of the power they have, this can change the full system. And this is not new. I mean, if you look to the Sustainable Development Goals, and again, a new story on the Sustainable Development Goals, you can come to the same conclusion. And I believe that everyone in the audience have seen this table. So we have different Sustainable Development Goals created by the United Nations in 2015. And the idea was to try to enforce these in this year, so over 1 decade. So the number one Sustainable Development Goal is no poverty, the number 2 zero hunger, and so on. And I was in a meeting in Geneva, I believe in 2018. It was a meeting of experts of the group for the extractive sector on the raw materials, and one of the experts challenged the audience to choose just one of these Sustainable Development Goals, thinking that, imagine that you have a superpower, and that superpower will allow you to implement one of these SDGs, just one. And so you need to think and see which SDG can have the capacity to leverage all the SDGs. And so we had some time to think, we had a discussion, and to make a long story short, at the end you have basically 2 SDGs that people was choosing mainly. One of them was the SDG 17, Partnerships for the Goals. And what this group of people was saying was that if you have institutions, and if you can bind together public and and also individuals, so also at different levels. So if you can put together all these efforts, if you can create partnerships, then it will be easy to attain the goals, and that will be having an effective, let's say, leverage for all the goals. This was one of the groups. The other group where I include myself was saying that the most relevant SDG was the SDG number 12, which is just on top of my image. So it was the responsible consumption and production. And we were saying that this is the most important because every individual in the planet can act as a consumer. And this is important because if you talk to people, and I've seen this in my family, if you talk with them about climate change, and you need to do something to have some action to curb CO2 emissions or whatever, people will go, well, what can I do? Because I'm just one. If you look to the big companies or big countries that are producing CO2, I cannot do anything. And the same thing happens if you are discussing zero hunger or if you are discussing clean water and sanitation. But if you tell people, no, it's responsible consumption because you are a consumer and you have a saying when you choose the products that you are buying. And if you choose the products that are coming from companies who are acting in a responsible way, who are producing in a responsible way, then you can have an impact. So responsible consumption is very much aligned with my perspective on consumer power. So this is the reason why I do believe that consumers who have the real power to curb the extraction and conflicts of conflict minerals. To close, I told you that I was coming from the International Raw Materials Observatory. It's one of the sponsors of the AGI Earth Science Week. If you want to have more insights even on future scenarios of minerals production, check the website of the observatory. Also, I'd like to highlight the World Barometer. This is an online publication that we made every 2 weeks, and it's like a news digest from news coming from different sectors, from business, from research, from science, from environment, from politics, that can have impact on the mineral sector. So I look forward for your questions. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you.